The year is 1418. A mighty fleet of ships cuts through the waves off the coast of Portugal. Their destination, the uncharted waters of the West African coast. Among them is the flagship of the King's Navy, a vessel of such immense size that it seems more like a floating fortress than a warship. Chroniclers would later describe it as a marvel of engineering, almost 100 feet wide and nearly 3 times as long as any other ship in the Portuguese fleet. It was a giant, a monster, a marvel that captured the imagination of sailors and landlubbers alike. But this was no mere boast. This was the crown jewel of Portugal's navy, the pinnacle of shipbuilding technology in a nation that was rapidly becoming a major player in the African slave trade and the race for gold and spices. And as the Portuguese explorers push farther and farther into the unknown, this ship and others like it become the key to their success. You might be thinking, okay, let's take a look at some real historical ships, and I hear you. That's coming next. But first let me introduce myself. I make videos about ancient history, including the series Ancient Worlds and Adventures in Ancient Greece. If you want to see my regular videos, you know where to find them. And now, back to the Portuguese ships. Now, if you're imagining a ship about the size of the largest cruise ships sailing today, then you're not quite there. Cruise ships can be up to 1,000 feet long, while the great Portuguese ships were closer to 200 feet. Still, they were large enough to carry about 300 men and enough supplies to sustain them on a voyage lasting several months. And that was a big deal. Now, there is some debate about exactly how large these ships were. We don't have exact blueprints or inventory records. What we know comes mostly from eyewitness accounts from sailors and merchants who actually sailed on these ships. The numbers they give vary, and modern historians have different ideas about how accurate those numbers really are. But the details they do provide us with give us a glimpse into life on board one of these massive ships. Imagine yourself on board. You're jostled by the movement of the ship, the creak of the timbers, the slap of the waves against the hull. The air is thick with the smell of salt and sweat. You navigate through a maze of decks and rigging, past sailors hauling ropes, past merchants tending to their wares, and past soldiers keeping watch. Life aboard these ships was not easy. Sailors endured harsh conditions, battling storms, disease, and the constant threat of piracy. Yet it was also a time of adventure and discovery, a chance to explore uncharted waters and bring back riches beyond imagination. So how did these giants compare to those of other navies? Well, not all nations had the resources or technology to build such large vessels. The Mediterranean powers, for example, focused more on maneuverable warships rather than cargo ships. But that doesn't mean they weren't impressed. When the Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus approached King Ferdinand and Isabella with his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, he asked for ships similar in size to those of the Portuguese. Granted, his request was ultimately denied, but that was only because of the king's desire to focus on conquering Granada. Had he agreed, who knows what impact that might have had on the New World. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and want to help out, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps my channel. Let's shift gears and head east. Our destination, the imperial shipyards of China. Here, under the watchful eye of the Yongle Emperor, a new type of giant is being born. By the early 15th century, China was a bustling hub of trade and innovation, its merchants sailing across the Indian Ocean to far-off lands. However, as Chinese goods flooded foreign markets, the emperor grew concerned. Counterfeit Chinese products were tarnishing the reputation of genuine Chinese goods. So he hatched a plan. He would send out a fleet unlike any the world had ever seen to seize counterfeit goods and assert Chinese dominance across the ocean. But that's just the beginning of the story. These ships, known as treasure ships, were massive vessels that played a pivotal role in the Ming Dynasty's maritime history. They were used not just for trade, but also for exploration and diplomacy, carrying precious cargo, diplomatic missions, and of course, the infamous treasure. Now, you might be wondering, how big are we talking here? Well, the treasure ships were reportedly over 400 feet long, nearly 100 feet wider than the Portuguese giants we discussed earlier. Imagine that. To put that in perspective, it's like comparing a standard school bus to a football field. And these ships were equipped with 9 masts and sails that dwarfed those of their contemporaries. They were so large that they needed multiple rudders to keep them on course, and their crews numbered in the thousands. Building ships of this magnitude required a Herculean effort. Thousands of workers toiled for years, cutting down trees, shaping the wood, and assembling the parts. The ships were so large that they needed to be built in dry docks and then floated into the water. And when they set sail, they were a sight to behold, dominating the horizon with their sheer size. But the treasure ships were not just about brute force. They were also marvels of engineering. The Chinese shipbuilders used advanced techniques to make their ships lighter and more stable. They also developed new tools and equipment to help them navigate the open seas. One of the most important innovations was the compass, which allowed sailors to determine their location and direction with greater accuracy. However, as impressive as these ships were, they were not without their limitations. While they were well suited for long-distance travel, they were not as maneuverable as smaller vessels, and they were also expensive to build and maintain. Despite these challenges, the treasure ships remained an important part of China's maritime tradition for several decades. They continued to be used for trade, exploration, and diplomacy until the Yongle Emperor's death in 1424. After that, the Chinese emperors became less interested in overseas ventures and more focused on controlling the seas. Okay, so now you're probably wondering how the stories of these great ships compare. Which one was really bigger? Well, unfortunately, we don't have enough information to say for sure. The numbers we have are often contradictory or unreliable. However, what we do know is that both the Portuguese and Chinese ships were marvels of engineering and design. They represent the ambition and ingenuity of their respective civilizations. So who really wins the title of biggest ship? Maybe it's not about size, but impact. Both the Portuguese and Chinese ships changed the world in their own ways. The Portuguese ships ushered in the age of discovery, connecting Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Chinese ships projected power and wealth across the Indian Ocean, influencing trade and diplomacy along the way. And who knows, maybe size doesn't matter. Maybe what truly makes a ship great isn't its dimensions, but its spirit, its ability to capture the imagination and inspire awe in those who see it. And on that note, I'll leave it to you. Which ship do you think is the true champion? Let me know in the comments below. While we wait for the ultimate showdown between the Portuguese and Chinese ships, let's turn our attention to another contender. Meet the largest ship ever built. What will blow your mind is not the size, but the weight. And if you want to learn more about the greatest battles in ancient history, check out my series Ancient Battles, available on a popular streaming service. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.